we would like to call forward the Sycamore Institute. And I see, I'm probably going to butcher your name, so you need to say it, if you'll say it anyway, and identify who you're with, please.
Good morning. Can you all hear me? All right, I'm good. All right. My name is Brian Straessle. I am the Executive Director of the Sycamore Institute, joined here with my colleague, Mandy Spears, who is our Deputy Director. Thank you for inviting the Sycamore Institute to share what we've learned in recent months about federal funding for K-12 education in Tennessee. As you may know, the Sycamore Institute is an independent and truly nonpartisan public policy research center for Tennessee. We exist to equip leaders like yourselves and people across our state with data-driven resources to identify, understand, and solve big challenges. Our approach to that work is a bit unique, however, because our staff and our board of directors come from across the political spectrum. Together, we take a straightforward approach to explain policy issues. That means we strive to produce information and analyses that are as impartial as humanly possible. As a result, we don't advocate or lobby. Instead, we strive to foster a more informed and productive discussion and debate about public policy issues in Tennessee. Sycamore's role is to be a resource for everyone, no matter what side of an issue you're on. In anticipation of this working group coming together, our team has spent time over the past few months learning about federal funding for K-12 education and what state and local officials must do in order to get that money. And I say learning because that is quite literally what we do. Sycamore works on a broad range of issues, from public finance to health to criminal justice to financial security. With a staff of 5, we don't pretend to be subject matter experts on absolutely every issue that we tackle. What we are expert generalists. Sycamore excels at digesting complicated policy issues and communicating what we learn in ways that everyone can hear, no matter your expertise or your political perspective. Now I will hand it over to Mandy to share what we've learned.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mandy Spears, the Deputy Director at the Sycamore Institute, and I don't want to over-caveat our presentation, but I also don't want to frustrate you when you ask me questions later and I say I don't know. So I did want to tell you a little bit about what I am and what I'm not. So I'm not a longtime education policy expert, and I'm not a constitutional lawyer or a lawyer at all. I used to be married to one, if that counts. What I am is a researcher. I do a lot of reading. I read things from lots of different perspectives. I talk to different people. I try to understand the history and context of an issue. I try to ask really good questions, and then I try to figure out what the themes and the complexities are, all the angles, and then we work really hard to explain it in a way that makes sense, regardless of sort of your level of expertise or your political perspective on an issue, so that you can make the decision that makes sense for you and your experiences and your values. I'm also human, so I might have missed some things or not thought of something from an angle that maybe is important to you. So those are my caveats. Now, trust me after I've told you all the things I'm not. Okay, so what I'm going to go through is a couple of reports that we have done over the last few months. So at the beginning of August, we did a report on federal funding for Tennessee school districts. And in this report, we just looked at how federal funding varied for school districts, how dependent they are on those dollars, and what kinds of things districts have in common that are most dependent or least dependent. Is there any themes that come out of that? That also included an interactive dashboard where you can go to our website and click on a district and see all the information about that district in terms of its dependence on federal funding, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then most recently, a couple weeks ago, we did a deep dive on, what is the federal government's role in K-12 education in general? What are the specific programs that they're involved in? What are some of the requirements that influence how K-12 operates? What are some recent tensions that the state has had with some of those requirements? And then out of all that research, we came up with sort of 11 trade-offs, considerations, and things to think about. So that's what I'm going to use my time for. So first, I'm just going to go through a 101 on federal K-12 funds. look at funding by district, and then I'm going to go through those 11 trade-offs and considerations. So first, just a very high-level overview. You guys got a really good overview yesterday from the Offices of Research and Education Accountability, so I'm not going to go quite as deeply as they did. But the first thing to know is that in 2019, which is the year that we looked at, so 1.8 billion is a number I think that we've heard a lot. The number we use is 1.1 just because we're looking at what does the state typically get from the federal government, setting aside all these big dollars that the state got during the pandemic. So we looked back at 2019, it was about 1.1 billion for the 5 years, including 2019 and before. But in 2019, districts across the state got about $10.6 billion in total revenue. About 41% of that came from local revenues, about 48% came from the state, and then about 11% was federal dollars that came through the state, and then less than 1% were federal dollars that school districts received directly from the federal government. So that 11%, let's put it in context, is that little sliver right here. So 11% of all K through 12 revenues came from the federal government through the state. On average, states in 2019, about 9% of their school revenues came from the federal government. And here is Tennessee in context with all 50 states. So Tennessee schools were more dependent on federal K through 12 dollars than all but 13 other states in 2019. So zooming back into the state level, that 11%, that's federal dollars. Most of that was for school nutrition, about 39%. About 27% was for Title I under the Every Student Succeeds Act, and so that's primarily focused on students who are low income. About 20%, formatting here's messed up, apologies for that, but about 20% came from the IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and then everything else was in that final 12% there. So let's talk about the requirements. So these dollars do come with requirements, but there are also some requirements that have broader applicability. So Tennessee's K through 12 activities are subject to both program-specific and broader federal requirements. So some examples of program-specific requirements under these bigger federal programs. So under Title I, for example, states have to show that they have academic standards in place, that they conduct assessments of how well students are actually achieving those standards, and they have to have accountability systems to help districts and schools improve when they fall behind. Under IDEA, it guarantees a free, appropriate public education for students with disabilities, and it requires that those students get an individualized education plan that lays out what those needs are for meeting that requirement. Under the child nutrition program, states have to provide free and reduced price meals to kids that meet certain eligibility criteria that's laid out by the federal government, and those meals have to meet federal nutritional guidelines. So just some, very high-level examples of program-specific requirements. But then there are some requirements that are tied to receiving any federal financial assistance. So federal financial assistance is basically any federal money. So if you get any federal dollars, you have to follow these other separate laws that are not associated with the program itself that you're actually getting the dollars for. So almost all of these are civil rights or anti-discrimination laws that must be followed. So recipients of federal financial assistance may not exclude or deny program benefits to individuals based on their race, national origin, sex, disability, or age. So these get interpreted within specific federal agencies and applied to specific program settings. So if you get Title I funding, for example, you can't discriminate in school settings in or outside of your Title I programs. And then there are very broad requirements that can affect K through 12 activities, regardless of whether the state is getting federal dollars at all. And that's because of protections in the Constitution. So the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, for example, was the basis for Brown v. Board of Education that overturned school segregation. That didn't have anything to do with federal dollars. It just had to do with states being part of the union. So why is it that the federal government gets to tell us what to do? So number one, the Supreme Court. It says states have certain responsibilities under the 14th Amendment, for example, to ensure equal protection, like I just mentioned. The federal government also has massive fiscal power, so the power of the purse. So it has a lot of money. The Supreme Court has said that it can not only spend that money on things that are not expressly mentioned in the Constitution, under the General Welfare Clause, like education, not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. But also the Supreme Court has said that when they spend that money, they have the authority to place requirements on that money that may extend beyond the purpose of the dollars themselves. Just how far those requirements can go is not set in stone. It's something that is continually challenged and continually refined by the courts. So that is why the federal government gets to tell us what to do, with or without federal dollars. So for this next part, I'm just going to go through how federal funding varies by school district. So the first takeaway here is that school districts vary widely in the federal funding that they receive and how much they depend on it. So first, just looking at total federal dollars here, the average was about $8 million per district. That ranged from a high of $193 million for Shelby County schools all the way to the right of the slide, and a low of just about $300,000 for the Richard City Special School District in Marion County, which is just one school. Federal funds per pupil, the average was about $1,200 across all districts. Again, this is in 2019, before the pandemic. And that ranged from a high of over $2,500 per student in Humboldt City School District in Gibson County to a low of about $300 per pupil in Williamson County. And then finally, dependency. So this is the percent of all of a district's revenues that are coming from the federal government through the state. On average, it was about 11%, like we saw on the slide earlier. And that ranged from a high of $1 and $5 all the way to the right there in that Humboldt City School District to a low of just 3% in Williamson County. So we also looked at the most dependent districts and the least dependent districts to see what they look like, if they have anything in common. And what we found is that compared to the least dependent school districts, the most dependent tended to have higher concentrations of low-income students, higher concentrations of students with disabilities, more dependent on state dollars, lower local fiscal capacity, lower achievement on assessments, and tended to be more rural. Some of these are probably less surprising than others. For example, the concentration of low-income students, the concentration of students with disabilities. These are things that drive the formulas that determine the federal dollars. And of course, some of these things are interrelated with one another. For example, we know low-income students tend to have a lower achievement on assessment. So these things are all sort of related to each other. We also looked at some other things that didn't seem to really be different across school districts, so things like district size, demographics, and they really weren't significantly different based on whether a district was more or less dependent. So here's what that kind of looks like in the actual numbers. So first, we're going to look at the percent of students who are economically disadvantaged. So across all school districts, about 35% on average, about 35% of all students are economically disadvantaged. Among the most dependent districts, so this is the top quartile or the 28 most dependent districts, about 43% of students were economically disadvantaged compared to about 23% in the least dependent districts. Looking at the percent rural, so across all school districts on average, about 80% of school districts, or 80% of the locales in school districts were considered rural. Across all districts, it was about 95% among the most dependent districts and about 45% among the least dependent districts. And then the last one I'm going to show you is where do a district's in-state revenues come from? So excluding the federal revenue, what's the funding split between state and local? So across all districts, it's about 2/3 coming from the state, 1/3 coming from locals on average. Among the most dependent districts, it was about 3/4 coming from the state and 1/4 coming from local. And among the least dependent districts, it was more like 50-50. So those most federally dependent districts also tend to be more dependent on state dollars. And if you look at sort of the TISA calculations, they tend to have lower fiscal capacity as well. So less ability to contribute their own dollars to their school districts. Okay, so you can explore all of these numbers on our website. We have a dashboard where, again, like I said, you can click on a district. You can see sort of the spread of federal dollars across the 3 big programs and everything else. You can see how much each district gets in per pupil funding, how that compares to other districts, and then the share of all of their revenues that are coming from the federal government. And then there's a second tab where you can kind of compare districts on a per pupil basis in terms of federal funding. Okay, so finally, after we did kind of all of the research, which there's a lot more behind it in the papers if you're interested, and talking to a lot of people, we identified 11 potential trade-offs and considerations as the result of our research. And I would say these fit into the bucket of not just, you know, things to think about if you were thinking of rejecting the money, but also things to think about for accepting the money. So the first thing is no one's ever rejected federal K through 12 dollars. So a lot of this is unknown. There are a lot of questions. Really, there are more questions than definitive answers about what rejecting the dollars could mean for Tennessee's obligations, because no state's ever done it. You know, in looking at the news reports, it looks like Oklahoma and South Carolina have maybe talked about it, but they haven't really taken any formal steps. So there's really not a lot of precedent on which to make predictions about what the issues and challenges would be. So a lot of this is just conjecture based on sort of our reading, our research, and the folks that we have talked to. The second takeaway is many of the requirements that are attached to federal dollars align with the state's own goals and or are integrated into the state's own requirements. So there's 2 implications here. 1, we're getting money for stuff that we might do anyway as a state, and 2, we'd have to figure out if and how to deal with the places where the state's own requirements are intertwined with federal requirements. So for example, state law requires an accountability system, a school grading system. These are sort of akin to the same types of requirements that are in Title I. So we are meeting Title I requirements with our own requirements in that situation. We have a lot of places where our laws and regulations are adopting federal laws and regulations, sometimes by reference. So we have adopted the Federal Nutrition Program regulations by reference. We have conditioned any state money for nutrition on meeting national nutritional standards and program eligibility requirements. And I think you heard yesterday that a lot of the IDEA and its regulations are adopted by reference in the state's own laws and regulations. So those are things we would just have to figure out if we'd keep all that stuff or if you'd want to make changes there as well. The third consideration is federal requirements provide assurances and an extra layer of accountability that are important to many children and their families. So federal laws guarantee rights to the populations that I discussed earlier in sort of that federal financial assistance bucket, and they lay out the formal processes for adjudicating complaints. These processes detail who can file complaints, when, where, and the steps that have to be followed as the complaint is investigated and resolved. Federal requirements also guarantee an additional layer of oversight beyond the state's processes, including due process through the federal court system. So complaints can be filed at the state level, the local level, and the federal levels, but in most cases they can also be filed in federal court. So federal oversight is important to a lot of stakeholders because of the history around those requirements. And that is, many of these requirements arose in response to discriminatory and exclusionary state practices. So a lot of this stuff came out of the civil rights movement at a time where there was rampant racial discrimination and school segregation, where students with disabilities were being excluded from the public school system altogether. So students and families in these protected classes may worry that such practices could return in the absence of federal oversight. Fourth takeaway, Tennessee has to adapt when federal requirements change. So when the Every Student Succeeds Act was passed in December of 2015, it had substantive changes from the law that came before it, which was the No Child Left Behind Act. In a lot of ways, it was less prescriptive, but in other ways, it had new requirements. Meanwhile, the state had just finalized its strategic plan right before it passed. So because federal law changed, federal regulation changed, the state had to revisit some aspect of that plan to either address the new requirements that were in the new federal law or to use the new flexibilities that didn't exist before. So those are administrative burdens that happen when the federal government shifts its priorities. The fifth takeaway, the federal government has not always fully funded its commitments. So some of the federal K through 12 dollars are specifically meant to offset the additional costs of meeting those federal requirements, but the funding levels for that haven't always lived up to promises. So the IDEA, for example, recognizes that students with disabilities cost more to educate. And it authorizes funding levels at the federal level that would cover up to 40% of those additional costs. However, Congress has never actually funded the IDEA at that level. As of 2019, the actual federal IDEA funding represented only about 14% of the estimated excess cost. Takeaway number 6. So if Tennessee rejected federal dollars, the state would have to work out many details to ensure a smooth transition for districts. Federal money and guidelines are woven into all levels of Tennessee's K through 12 system, so the state would likely need a thoughtful transition plan to minimize disruption for districts. Districts are already facing challenges from the switch to the state's new school funding formula, TISA, and the end of supplemental federal funding related to COVID-19. So some examples of questions that you all would want to consider or answer would include things like, how much federal funding would Tennessee want to replace with its own dollars? How would those dollars be allocated? Would they be allocated in the same way as existing federal dollars, or would they flow through the state's existing funding formula? Would the state replacement affect how much locals are required to put towards school funding? What federal requirements would Tennessee want to maintain for school districts? How would state law and regulation need to change to accommodate those requirements that the state wanted to maintain or modify? So just a few examples of the types of questions that would need to be thought through. Number 7. A long one. The days of historically large surpluses may be over, but Tennessee likely still has room in the budget to replace federal funding, but at the expense of other potential investments. So let's unpack that. First, the days of historically large surpluses may be over. So Tennessee's revenue collections fell short of expectations in fiscal year 2023 after years of historic budget surpluses. So here you see the last 9 years of year-end surpluses for the budget. So we had huge ones exceeding $2 billion in 2021 and 2022, but revenues fell about $330 million short of 2023 expectations. Here is our monthly revenue tracker that we keep on our website. What you see in the top right corner is that 2 months into fiscal year 2024, the state's already fallen about $50 million short of projections. Actually, during yesterday's work group meeting, the State Funding Board heard from experts in order to revisit this year's projection and look into next year's budget. Folks are thinking that collections this year are going to be flat or even negative, and then a wide range of predictions into 2025, everything from sort of flat to 5% growth. So we're in very uncertain times in terms of the economy and what's going to happen in the longer term. Even so, Tennessee likely still has room in the budget to replace federal dollars. So this is a graphic from our 2024 budget summary where we showed where the money in the governor's budget was coming from and where it was going. Don't squint too hard. The takeaway here is that the recurring revenues, so that is the budget, that is the blue or gray bar on the left side, is higher than the recurring allocations, the blue or gray on the right side. So that is, you all used recurring revenues and allocated them for one-time purposes. So that means they're still in the 2025 base and haven't been allocated yet. So after changes made during the regular and special session and that year-end shortfall that I just talked about, there's still probably about $2.2 billion in recurring revenues that are available before any additional revenue growth for the 2025 budget. So that would be more than enough to cover the $1.1 billion the state typically receives for K through 12 education, and then usually there's about $1 billion in recurring needed to fund annual routine cost increases, so things like state employee salary increases and benefits, student growth, inflationary cost increases. Having said that, the money is there, but as with any decision, it comes with an opportunity cost. So that is what else could be done with those dollars. So replacing federal dollars with state dollars would be done at the expense of other potential investments. $1.1 billion is a lot of money. We'll put that in context. So compared to state revenues, for example, $1.1 billion is equivalent to about 4% of all state dollars in the general fund. About 8% of the sales tax we're expected to collect this year, and about 23% of all of the franchise and excise taxes we're expected to collect this year. $1.1 billion is also more than any of the recurring increases to the Tennessee Department of Education over the last decade. So this is every recurring increase appropriated over the last decade for TDOE, including the historically large one for TISA implementation that was built into the 2023 budget. And then finally, $1.1 billion is more than the budgets of all but about 4 or 5 state agencies. TDOE, TennCare, TDOT, THEC, TDOC, TDOC, depending on the year you're looking at, those are the only agencies that get more than $1.1 billion in state dollars each year. Okay, takeaway number 8, we're getting close. If rejected, much of Tennessee's federal education funding would probably go to other states. It's just how the formulas work for those dollars. So all the formulas for the programs that are funded through the U.S. Department of Education, so not the USDA one, not the school nutrition dollars, they're distributed to states based on a formula. So if Tennessee rejected some or all of that $700 million that it receives through those programs, those funds wouldn't result in taxpayer savings unless Congress reduced its funding amounts by that same amount. While it is possible that Congress could do that, it does seem more likely that those funds would just be redistributed to other states. Number 9, federal requirements create administrative burdens that may or may not still exist if Tennessee rejected federal dollars. So how administrative burdens would change might depend on what level of government you're talking about. So federal requirements certainly create administrative burdens. There's lots of required reporting and processes. These burdens fall both on state government, but also on the local school districts as well. So certainly state officials would likely no longer have to fulfill most or all of those reporting requirements. The difference for the local school districts, however, is less clear. That would depend on how rejecting federal dollars would change what the state requires of the local school districts. So, for example, state law already requires numerous plans and reports from districts. The state would likely replace some of the federal requirements with its own requirements, and those would come with continued reporting and oversight for districts. So it would just depend on what the state required of the local districts of how it would affect the administrative burdens for districts. Number 10, many federal requirements could still apply to Tennessee schools even if the state rejected federal K through 12 dollars, creating questions that would likely be resolved in court. Why is that? Well, number one, cutting every dollar that tethers the state to federal requirements could be nearly impossible. And two, some requirements could still apply with or without any federal dollars. Because of its broad application, the requirements associated with that broad definition of federal financial assistance could still apply depending on the scope of the state's rejection of federal dollars. So, for example, in fiscal year 2019, 72 Tennessee school districts received about $60 million directly from the federal government, so not through the state. And then in addition to those sums, there may be other less obvious ways that schools receive or benefit from federal assistance. So think about TennCare reimbursement for certain services provided in school. I had a local lawmaker come up to me recently and tell me about the money they receive for junior ROTC through the Department of Defense. And so we just don't know how those other types of dollars could trigger those federal financial assistance associated mandates. Other protections could still apply also, things that the Supreme Court has decided on that were sort of outside of a question about dollars related to students with disabilities, English learners, and of course those protections in the 14th Amendment. What requirements apply when and how would likely be worked out in the court system. And those questions could take some time to figure out. Finally, it is unclear if Tennessee would still get federal education aid to weather recessions and how quickly the state could reverse course if policymakers change their mind. So to that recession point, in recent history, the federal government has supplemented K-12 funding to help states weather recessions. So this shows federal revenue for TDOE all the way back to 1990. These slivers right here of pink are recessions. So during and after the Great Recession, for example, TDOE's federal revenues grew to $1.5 billion or 30% of the department's budget. This was a critical resource for plugging holes in the state budget during and after the Great Recession, so it helped the state maintain its overall investment in K-12 education while plugging holes elsewhere in the budget, so it was important for the entire budget. These amounts obviously were even greater, sort of unprecedented during and after the COVID pandemic to address both the recession but also additional needs that the schools had. So if we rejected federal money, would we still have access to relief during times of emergencies? We don't know. There are also questions about how quickly the state could reaccess federal dollars after rejecting them, should we change our minds. So for example, how long would the federal government give Tennessee to come back into compliance with its requirements before dispersing funds? Could Tennessee still meet certain fiscal requirements that are associated with the dollars, like maintenance of effort and supplement, not supplant requirements, if we wanted to withdraw our state funding that we had previously used to replace it with rejected federal dollars? So these are just some of the things that kind of came out as themes, trade-offs, considerations when doing our research. Really appreciate the time that you've given us, and of course, happy to answer any questions that we can.
Thank you very much for all the slides and information, and your thoroughness is very interesting and a lot to, again, to be reminded of, to consider. And so members, I'll recognize, yes, Senator White.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you so much for this in-depth presentation. Really appreciate all your time you've put into this. Going back to some of the consequences that may or may not happen, number 5, you said that the federal government sometimes does not live up to their obligations, and you used the IDA. Is there anything else other than the IDA that they are not living up to their obligations?
I don't know off the top of my head. I would have to look further into that for you.
Okay. One more question, Madam Chairman.
Yes,
right?
Go ahead, please.
And then you said that historically they've done 14% out of the 40. So is the state or the locals picking up the rest that the federal government is not covering?
I can't say what fully funded would look like, so it's like they envision a certain amount that it would cost to meet these requirements, and they say we'll pick up 40% of this hypothetical amount. But yes, everything else is being picked up by local governments to the extent that the needs are being met of students with disabilities. So yes. But I can't say if it's like actually, 86% of that hypothetical amount, because every student's needs are different.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, I see. I can't. Yes, Senator Hensley.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And yesterday, the comptroller told us a little bit different percentages about the nutrition program and the IDEA program than what y'all did. But you said that the nutrition funds was the largest percentage we received?
Yes, sir. That was based on looking at district revenues in 2019.
Okay, and as far as you can tell, are the requirements for us receiving nutrition funds only required to nutrition and requiring that they have nutritious food, or are there any other requirements that you could tell that are tied to the nutrition funding?
Right. So there are those broader requirements associated with federal financial assistance that then get interpreted by the individual agencies that are carrying out these programs at the federal level. So what that has translated to in recent years, for example, is the USDA has issued some guidance around the application of Title IX in school settings that is tied to the receipt of those dollars related to nutrition. So it's sort of the nutrition dollars are the hook for these other requirements. But the Federal Department of Education has also issued similar guidance related to their programs as well that are tied to that those Title IX requirements.
So they've tied Title IX requirements to the nutrition funding?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam
I think
Chairman.
there's a pending lawsuit from the state of Tennessee against both the USDA and the U.S. Department of Education related to those requirements. Those requirements have not gone into effect. They've just been proposed.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Chairman Reagan, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the presentation. Also, thank you for the materials you sent us in advance. Some of my questions are going to be related to those previous ones. However, to the, Madam, if I could, I have a series of questions.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Let's revisit one of the questions from yesterday, and I would like to get your input on this. We asked yesterday about the compliance costs, and that particular issue, the example you just brought up, Title IX puts certain requirements on the state at both K through 12 and higher education levels, which the feds do not provide money for. So how much is it costing the state to comply with these that are not covered by federal dollars?
I would have no idea the answer to that question. That there's no data that I'm aware of that's related to that that's publicly available, but I do think that would be a great question to ask of the districts and the department.
Follow-on questions then. A slightly different topic. In one of your earlier slides, you talked about most dependent versus least dependent, and in some of your presentations that you sent us earlier, we have some good scatter plots with some R-squareds associated with the data that's in front of us. The question that is in the top of my mind is how we get this money that's supposedly aimed at the most needy students and the lowest performing students. What's the measure of improvement for this money coming in? How much has it improved the performance of these students?
That is an excellent question. It's not one that we have looked into yet, but I think that as you explore paths, around this question of taking or not taking federal education funding, that's certainly a valid question to ask.
Well, again, correlation is not causation. Anybody that knows statistics will vouch for that. That said, though, if we are tying ourselves to the federal government by accepting their money to do this thing, then it would have seemed to me that we as a state should be looking for the improvements that this money is purportedly going to make. Otherwise, we're just throwing money at something and being potentially wasteful. That goes back to the other issue that I asked about, though, the compliance issue. Yesterday, a question was addressed concerning the nutrition program related to the waste that's involved in that. To my knowledge, there is no measurement of that waste. Are you aware of any measure?
In terms of food waste,
Yes.
I'm not aware. No, I don't know the answer to that.
So the measure's not there, you're just not aware of it?
I'm not aware if there is a measure, sir.
All right, so then along that line there, in one of your slides, I think on number 3 there, the extra layer of accountabilities that are in addition to what the state requires, and as you correctly pointed out, the state does routinely change our requirement levels to match the federal levels because the federal government threatens to withhold money if we don't. Now, some of those are initiated at the state level, without a doubt, but most of it, to my experience, seems to be driven by the federal government saying, if you don't change your rules to match ours, we will take money. That then drives the question that what the good senator next to me asked about. They seem to be taking money out of any pot, not just that which is connected to what they're giving. Is that correct? It was mentioned that the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Department of Defense gives money, but yet we have the Department of Education saying, we're going to take that money because you're not doing something and something we tell you, which is completely unrelated to those things.
Right, so those are those federal financial assistance requirements where they extend beyond the purpose of the program, but because you are receiving funding through the federal government, regardless of what it's for, you must meet these other broader requirements in how you carry out the setting in which that money is being received.
But the arbiter of how well we're doing that is purely in the U.S. Department of Education, is that correct?
Well, no, it provides a due process through the federal court system as well. So you could go through the Office of Civil Rights within the U.S. Department of Education, but you could also file suit within federal court. You can also file complaints at the local or the state level as well. It just depends on each, I mean, again, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an expert in these particular things, but based on my research, it really depends on which law you have a complaint under in terms of who you can go to first, what options you have to, as a parent, for example, or a student, what options you have to exhaust before you can get to other higher level options, for example. Sometimes you have to exhaust sort of the administrative process before you can go to the courts. Sometimes you can go straight to the courts. In terms of who you go to first at the local, state, or federal level, you have an option. It's up to you. As the parent or student, depending on which of the kind of laws you're talking about. If you're talking about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, if you're talking about Title IX of the Education...
1972.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you. So it just kind of depends on what provision and what law you have a complaint under as a student or a parent.
But as a state,
yes,
if we were to make the decision,
Yeah.
and obviously no one's made it yet, but if we were to make the decision that the funding for this particular program, pick one, I don't care what it is something that we're going to cover as a state, we want to be rid of the federal string tied to this particular program. We can't do that because the federal government can say, okay, well, we'll just withhold it for over here.
right. So that is the question, is because there are lots of dollars flowing to schools in lots of different ways from the federal government, it's possible some of those requirements would still apply.
And this gets back, I think, to the point of a lot of these questions likely being resolved in court, because I could imagine a scenario in which something like that happens and the state sues the federal government to, say that, no, you can't take that money away from us.
Well, Madam Chair, if I could, to her point, though, the Uniform Administrative Procedures Act has within it adjudication procedures, due process, if you will. And since many of the things we're talking about come about by virtue of rules, that would be the logical place to go. That said, we have court cases that are preventing that, and even if we were to go that route, the problem with the administrative route is that the administrative agency is its own legislator. It makes its rules, and it appoints its own judges, and then it also enforces it. So it is a bit of a lack of fairness there.
So I would say that there is a lot of politics that would be involved in a lot of these questions at both the state level and the federal level, because one thing that we do go into the report is like, how are these requirements decided? Some, yes, flow from the U.S. Constitution, flow from federal law, but a lot of them are getting interpreted and reinterpreted within each administration and how they apply to specific programs. Sometimes it's through, the Federal Register, very official kind of regulatory processes, and sometimes it's in sub-regulatory guidance, a letter to states that tells them what to do. And so, what you've seen, I think, in response to, I think it's like 20 some odd states have filed suit against the federal government over, including Tennessee, over some of these Title IX things from the Department of Education and from USDA, is that you've seen the federal administration sort of withdraw those things for the time being, sitting on them because of some of the controversy around that. There are other things I think is very much, especially like the last slide, for example, where we said, how quickly could Tennessee get the dollars back if we rejected the money and then we hit a bad patch and we said, actually, we would like to have those back. If you had a administration at the federal level that was at odds with the politics here, they could make it hard on us, or they could make it easy on us if it was the other way around. So a lot of this stuff is kind of squishy because as you say, a lot of it is getting done at the administration level versus at the congressional level.
Thank you. Madam Chair, one last question, if I could, please. And I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it for the sake of the record. Do we have any idea what percentage of the federal dollars that come to Tennessee for these various education programs are actually from the revenue that Tennessee submits to the federal government versus what comes back and the federal government borrows, for example, to send?
Oh, borrows. In general, I could not say specifically on the education dollars. I think that, let me think of the right words here. In general, Tennessee gets more than it traditionally has gotten more than it gives in federal dollars in general. We pay less in income tax than we get back as a state, just because our median income and our poverty rates.
But we don't have any clue as to whether that's just for roads or for any particular program.
Most of it, it's just going to
again.
The
Thank you for your
treasury.
presentations. Appreciate your time. Thank you,
you.
Madam Chair.
Thank you. Next on the list, Representative Glenn.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for, coming in today and giving this briefing. I'll be honest up front. I think the briefing speaks for itself and says that we have no reason to be here talking about rejecting funds. This clearly states that we don't need to do that. But I will ask a couple of questions. The federal money that we receive is tied to a requirement that we must meet. We received federal funds for transportation. Back in 2020, I believe, Tennessee refused to lower their blood alcohol content to match the federal level. But we tend to follow the federal regulation when we come to transportation. We didn't go to court and sue them because we didn't like the answer. That is tied to federal money because they provide oversight, and I think that's a good thing. We talked about, the federal government hasn't always fully funded its commitment. Also in 2020, it was discovered that Tennessee had a $1.7 billion shortfall in public education dollars. We haven't fully funded our commitment as well. There's much money that we could give to our public education system, and we're not doing that. Also, you talked about federal requirements provide assurance and extra layers. I would think we need those extra layers. I would think civil rights, making sure we treat all our kids with dignity and respect is important. Making sure that our lower income, our most needed kids receive what they're entitled to. So I say all that to say we have a responsibility, and our responsibility is really simple: to take care of our future generation, to ensure that we give them the necessary resources to be successful. The conversation of rejecting funds because we do not like a standard or a requirement that adds protection to ensure that we're doing what we're supposed to do, it makes no sense to me. We have to do what's right. And I really hate that the federal government has to tell us to do that. We should be doing it anyway. So I didn't really have a question, I just had a statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on my list, I have Representative Slater.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your presentation today. You touched on some program-specific as compared to broad federal requirements. And I have questions regarding Title I. And specifically, you touched on academic standards and then assessments. So my question would be, which academic standards are federally mandated that otherwise may not be involved or incorporated in state academic standards? And then the same question when it comes to assessments. So it's kind of two different questions. And with the assessment piece, what assessments are we requiring of students that otherwise would not be required if we did not accept federal funds?
So on what the federal government requires, it's repeated at least twice in the Every Student Succeeds Act that the federal government cannot in any way require states to adopt specific standards or specific assessments or even review the assessments or review the assessment questions. Instead, the standards, the Department of Education will, others probably, all kinds of people will know this, but I don't. It's some language around challenging or something like that, and otherwise. In fact, I'm not even sure they have to review the standards. You just have to document that you have the standards in your state plan. And then on the assessment front, I think there's a little table, right here in the second report that we did. They require reading, math, and science assessments, and they require a certain frequency. And that is the extent of the assessment requirements. Then there are some requirements around, everybody in the same grade has to be getting the same assessment. And the reasoning there is, if you're giving two different assessments in 10th grade, you can't compare two schools apples to apples. It's apples to oranges or whatever. And then there's requirements around only so many people, a certain percentage of your students can get an alternative assessment. And again, it's all geared towards making sure that it's meaningful, that you can actually compare schools and that you're not getting it out because you're giving too many students an alternative assessment that may be easier or something like that. So the state has had issues meeting some of those requirements associated with the percentage of students getting an alternative assessment and providing the same assessment to everyone in the same grade. So I guess that has probably been the biggest issue based on my research that the state has come into conflict with the federal government with, is that, I guess according to the state standards, there's two pathways that a student can take in high school for math, for example. And if you go down one pathway, you get one assessment. If you go down the other, you get a different assessment in, say, 9th or 10th grade or whatever. And according to federal requirements, we can't do that. Everybody has to have the same assessment of math so that you can compare, all the kids in the school against each other, or two schools or two districts or whatever. So that's been a problem. What the state would do in the absence of, obviously it would do two different assessments for the two different standard pathways, but I couldn't say, you know, I think that would be up to you all and the Department of Education. Apologies for anyone watching if I just completely butchered any of that.
Thank you. A follow-up on a different topic, Madam Chair. And this would have to do with administrative costs. Yesterday, the Comptroller's Office was unable to quantify what administrative costs might look like absent federal funds, or what they are currently as we receive federal funds. Has the Sycamore Institute looked at administrative costs, what those may look like at both the district level and then at the state level as well?
I just can't say it. We have not looked at that. It would be a great answer to have. Obviously, there are staff that are funded with federal dollars. There are staff at the district level that do nothing but federal compliance. But again, not all of those requirements for districts would probably go away. There would still be some reporting to the state, I would think, just depending on what you all wanted to do. But no, I mean, I think that would be very hard to isolate, but again, a great question for the department and for the districts.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Any other? Excuse me, Senator Berry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Certainly, Sycamore, appreciate you all. The dashboard that you've created has been very helpful. Your presentation was as well. I want to dig a little deeper on some of your slides, specifically looking at slide 14, most versus least dependent school districts. Can you kind of give me a little bit more of a breakdown of what exactly you're saying? So you're saying that 95% of rural school districts are the most federally dependent?
No, sorry. I think the one that you're referring to is rural.
Yes.
So, what did I say? Portion of each school district in a locale designated as rural or town. So the Census Bureau, you know, it designates geographic land as being rural or urban or whatever. So here we're saying that in the 28 most dependent school districts, on average, about 95% of those districts are considered rural areas.
Okay.
And of the least dependent districts, about 45% of the area in those districts is considered rural.
Okay.
This was just a way to show it. We also did, as Chairman Reagan pointed out, a scatter plot. So it works out, you know, for the data people in the crowd. It works out both ways, but this was a way to kind of illustrate the point without a scatter plot.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So essentially what we're saying is it's not just an urban issue, it's a rural issue, it's a state of Tennessee issue where our school districts are relying on these federal funds. Is that correct?
Yeah, and a lot of it is because it's driven by that, you know, concentration of low-income students, and our rural areas just tend to have, a lot of them have higher poverty rates, so.
I got you. Okay, I have several questions. Is that okay? Okay, perfect. Now I want to kind of talk a little bit about, you all talked about the kind of reason why the federal government has these strings, because they are seeking to protect protected classes of people who have historically been discriminated against. I think that's something that we really have to keep in mind, right? Like, my mother could only go to the zoo on a certain day because of segregation. I think that we have folks in our disabled communities that were historically excluded. I remember when I was in school, it was a certain classroom. We weren't integrated into classrooms with every other student. And so if we reject these federal funds, we would still have to provide those protections for our students. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's really, the courts would be figuring out the contours of those protections in the absence of, I mean, a way to think about it is the Constitution guarantees these sort of broad protections, and then Congress stepped in and put specifics around it with these laws. And I think in the absence of those laws, we'd have to, figure out through the court system, what is the obligation on the ground of a state or a local school district in providing that constitutional protection.
And some of our state laws already reflect or mirror the federal laws with those protections, right?
Yes.
So potentially, and this is saying, okay, say we decide we don't want to accept these funds, right? And then we have to go back and change our laws, I guess. And then we say, oh, wait, we need those funds. We'd have to go back and change those laws to comply with the federal government, conceivably, right?
Well, I don't know if it would work out exactly that way, or if it would work out on the ground through the court system in individual ways. I mean, I did try to just get a sense of like how often are our school districts getting sued today under the requirements? Are we, we're still figuring out on an individual level what some of these requirements mean for specific students. And there's countless lawsuits open across the state to make sure that students with disabilities, for example, are getting the services that they feel like they're entitled to get benefit from education. So I would, those would continue, and I would suspect, just given sensitivity around, this, that those might ramp up. I don't know,
Okay.
It's a lot of, Brian.
I wouldn't assume that rejecting federal funds would prompt you all to change what the state requirements are. You certainly could do that, and you could choose to, supplement existing state requirements to, bring in maybe more things that match the federal requirements that we would no longer be subject to. I think the point that we were trying to make around the fact that this is an open question, and so that folks who value those protections might be concerned, is, to our knowledge, there has not yet been a very detailed conversation on what sort of protections the state would want to keep, either its existing state protections or federal ones. And as long as those kind of questions are outstanding and not yet fully resolved, I think it's likely that any decisions y'all did make would still be adjudicated in lawsuits, so that this would probably be a question that would not be fully settled for some time.
Okay. Okay, so throughout y'all's presentation and the presentation from the comptroller's office as well yesterday, there's no real ability to quantify the cost of administering or accepting these federal funds. So if we were to reject these funds, we really couldn't put it on the basis of that. So conceivably, there would be other strings that we don't want to abide by, like Title IX or like protection for students with disabilities or the Civil Rights Act. I mean, otherwise, it doesn't seem to me that there's any numerical data to support rejecting these funds. If anything, it supports accepting them, because we are seeing, out of my 10 years in the General Assembly, we're starting to see less than projected revenue. So can you kind of give me, am I clear that we have no idea truly, just because this is so uncharted, because no other state has made this potentially catastrophic decision before, we don't know exactly how much money a state would save by doing this, like offsetting the funds versus the cost of administering the programs required under the funds?
Yeah, we don't have any data to quantify that.
Okay. All right. Well, I have one last question, Mr. Chair, or Madam Chair, chairs. And and that is just that this is uncharted territory, right? Do you guys foresee being able to kind of get additional information on numbers from the Federal Department of Education? Should we seek information from them? Do you think it's more of a State Department thing, or working together? And I only ask because I know I trust you guys with numbers 1,000%, and so I just want to know where you think we should go if we want to keep digging.
I mean, I think the feedback you're going to get from the district is probably a really good starting point. I don't know. The Attorney General's office, like they.
Sorry, that's a hard question.
I mean,
I withdraw my question. Thank you.
All right, anyone else? Representative Glenn.
I will ask a couple of questions just for sure. So you spoke earlier of if we reject those funds, that Tennessee could make that up at the cost of other investments. What investments would that be? An example, what kind of investment will we have to give up?
That'd be up to you all. I, just gave a few data points to put the size of those dollars in context, but that, it would be anything from spending money on something else to a tax cut or whatever.
Okay.
whatever you wanted to spend $1.1 billion on.
So whatever we don't want to spend $1.1 billion on. Is that what you said?
Whatever other thing you would if not for rejecting federal funds.
Okay. Now that would kind of be hard since you said we're going to be in a surplus, right? We're going to lose money going to try to make that up in other investment. Is that correct?
Well,
I mean, a deficit. I'm
So the
sorry.
decisions that you all made in the past two budgets do leave room. So, you have your recurring base budget. This is the money you think you're going to get every single year. And usually from one year to the next, the only thing you have to spend, the only money you have to spend on new things is new recurring dollars you think you're going to get from revenue growth, or if you cut stuff. But because of the way the economy's been the last few years, you all decided to use new recurring dollars that you thought you were going to get on non-recurring things. So that only obligates them for a single year. So they're still in that base budget for the next year. You've made the mistake of asking me a super wonky question that I'm now giving a very wonky answer to, but and I apologize for that. So you basically have a couple billion in your base budget even before revenue growth to put towards recurring things beginning in 2025. Sorry, I could draw a picture. I'm very good at pictures.
So after the first year of those $1 billion that the 1.1 we would lose, then at some point, in order to ensure we can continue that, would we have to raise taxes?
Well, as long as your revenues are staying flat or growing, you would have it in there because those are recurring. Those are considered to be recurring dollars. So we think as a state we're getting them forevermore unless we cut taxes. So.
But it's not a guarantee.
Well, no.
So we could possibly end up raising taxes.
Or cutting things in other areas.
Okay, that's what I had. Thank you.
Representative Slater.
I wanted to come back and thank you for weighing in a little bit on the legal aspects, and you did qualify that by saying that you're not an attorney, but you did weigh in a little bit. I think I'd like to make sure that there's clarity that as it relates to rejecting federal funds for education, that doesn't mean that Tennessee or really any state, because of the supremacy clause of the Constitution, that we could reject, for example, the civil rights legislation. So this is not a question about civil rights as much as it is dollars and cents what we would accept or reject. Is that correct?
Any dollars that you rejected, really the only requirements that you would no longer be under would be the requirements to that specific pot of money. As Mandy explained, the broader sort of civil rights related requirements that we're subject to no matter what would still be there.
Yeah, and you had referenced Brown, for example. A watershed case, 1954. Just because a state may reject federal funds, that doesn't mean that that state is going to go back to pre-Brown days as it relates to civil rights or the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That would not cause a state to go back to pre-civil rights or pre-Brown.
Right. So I'm going to say two things. One, I think the question then becomes, well, what are the state's requirements or obligations under the Civil Rights Act, for example? if there's no longer the programmatic specific dollars there associated with it. I mean, it's almost like, I think it would, I don't think we're implying that we would go back to pre-civil rights days, but I mean, I think as maybe some reports have shown, some conversations I've had, you know, a lot of these things were not that long ago for people that are still very much active and alive and well, and I think it's just hearing that is scary for something that, you know, because they're not sure what strings you might be talking about when they read about it in the newspaper. They've just heard that, you know, we don't, you know, some of the federal requirements are too much. There's a lot of strings attached to them. They, as Brian said, there hasn't been a lot of specifics around what kinds of protections we would want to keep ourselves as a state. And so I just think it's scary. It's a scary thing to hear, probably.
If I could add to that, I think you should think about those broader sort of civil rights type of requirements as sort of a basic broad category. And then the more programmatic, so, you know, for example, you can't, no matter what, discriminate on the basis of sex, you know, race, disability, et cetera. The IDEA, for example, gets more specific on how, right? It's like an implementation of that, that concept. And so if the state was no longer subject to those federal requirements for IDEA, the question then becomes, how does the state have to exactly meet its obligations under those broader civil rights requirements?
Like, what does it look like on the ground if a kid needs an aid in the classroom and the school isn't giving it, or if they feel like they need an aid and the school isn't giving it to them? What does the Constitution guarantee that student versus the IDEA? So it's really about that gray area between the very broad protection in the Constitution. They're going to take my law license away. I don't have one. So that gray area between the Constitution, you know, very broadly, and then the specifics of the IDEA.
Yeah. Madam Chair, if I could follow up, and you use the term scary, and I don't want folks to be scared that somehow that any decision, future decision, because we're not here to make decisions on this body. We're here to investigate, research, and then provide a report. But that any future decisions of the Tennessee State Legislature could destroy the foundation that our U.S. Constitution gives us when it comes to civil rights. So there shouldn't be any thing scary there. The Constitution provides a floor, not a ceiling for rights. In fact, other states may grant to their citizens more rights, more opportunities than the federal government does. The state of Tennessee, we can grant more rights, more protections for our citizens than the federal government does. The U.S. Constitution only provides for us a floor, not a ceiling for the rights of our citizens. So I don't think that there needs to be really any fear that civil rights are going to be taken away. Those are guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution and then supported, of course, by the Tennessee State Constitution as well. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't mean to neglect that side. Senator Ackberry.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I normally don't like to speak more than once, but Representative Glenn brought up a good point that kind of I have some questions about. Specifically, so we know, again, I said, since I've been here, we've had surpluses, but in 2009, through 2014 or whatever, 2007, the Great Recession, right? Tennessee's revenues were $1 billion less than what they expected in one fiscal year. Can you tell me, or if you know, obviously we have to fund our formula, but discretionary funds for our school systems reduced by over 30%. Do you have any data or information you can share about that time, or like what it potentially could look like when we have a budget downturn and we have to actually cut programming?
Yeah, so we did a report on this, I think in like early 2020 as we hit the pandemic, just to do kind of a full look back history of what happened during the Great Recession, because of course we had no idea what kind of recession we were looking at that time. And, I think over the course of many years, a lot of actions got taken to get the state's budget through not just the Great Recession, but obviously the after effects that went on for many years. And it included, tapping the rainy day fund, tapping reserves from all other, any other program that had a reserve that the state could tap, they did tap. There were cuts made to, I think, higher education in particular. There were things like state employee freezes, and then just keeping things sort of constant. Tennessee weathered it much better than a lot of other states did because they had all these different tools at their disposal. And of course, one of those tools was federal funding as well. And the feds, have a couple different places they can go to give states money to help them out. And so even though it goes towards a specific program, it's really helping the whole state budget. And those tools are typically, K through 12 money. 10 Care is always a big one. They up their match during that time, and usually some infrastructure dollars. So we're happy to send that report around as a resource.
Thank you, because I think while we are facing, not the Great Recession, but a bit more uncertainty than we have had, it's important to keep in mind that the federal government really does help us stay afloat, and the consequences of having to cut state programming. I mean, this is not something that's hypothetical. It has happened before. And it could happen again. So thank you for that. I look forward to seeing that report. And the last thing I'll say is, yes, we are protected by the United States Constitution and the state constitution. However, there are people across this state who feel like their rights are being, kind of restricted on a daily basis. If you look at the string of lawsuits against the state of Tennessee and the unsuccessful defense of those lawsuits, we know that someone's interpretation of constitutional protections could be different than what the courts is. So I think that it is righteous and correct to fear when you are in a protected class. A lot of people don't know what that feels like, but when you are in a protected class, to fear those rights being taken away. And so my commitment, when I took my oath, when I was sworn in to uphold the United States Constitution and the state constitution, meant fighting to protect the least of these among us. And that's something that I will always do. Thank you so much, Chair Lady and Chairman.
You are welcome. So I think you'll send all of us that report too that you mentioned, yes? Looking for other commenters? Okay. Well, seeing none, we are very, again, grateful. It's been very informative. And God bless you for weathering all the questions and your transparency. We really do appreciate you very much. And thank you for helping us through this. And to the audience and members, we will just go into recess since we'll be coming back this afternoon at 2 o'clock. Same room. And
1 o'clock.
Oh, I'm sorry. Daylight savings time? I don't know. Anyway, 1 o'clock we will be here in the same room. So we are now in recess.